Hello and welcome to Close Reading Classic Literature with me, Dr. Octavia Cox. Today I want to look at APHRA Behn's fascinating poem To the Fair Clarinda, which was published in 1688. In particular, I want to look at the way that she plays with and challenges gender norms and gender expectations and gender identity. I'm going to start with a very quick biography to introduce APHRA Behn to anyone who isn't particularly familiar with her, and then I'm going to move on to look at the poem To the Fair Clarinda in close detail and analyse the poem closely. So, who was APHRA Behn? Well, she was born, we think, although we don't know, but we think she was born in 1640. We don't know because the records are scanty and because Behn herself played with and sowed different seeds about her own past. But she may have been the daughter of a barber and so from a lower middling sort of family. But she rose to become noticed in the court of Charles II, and she may even have been a spy for Charles II in Belgium. She died in 1689. So she lived in the 17th century during the English Civil War. And obviously I don't have time today to go into lots of detail about the English Civil War, but very quickly, she lived through the deposing of Charles I, who was beheaded in January 1649. She lived through the interregnum, as it was called if you were a royalist, or the Commonwealth if you were a parliamentarian, from 1649 on to 1660. And she lived through the restoration of the monarchy, the restoration of Charles II in 1660. With the restoration of the monarchy came the restoration, you might say, of theatre. So theatre had been banned during the interregnum or the Commonwealth, and under Charles II, theatres were opened again. Now this is an important part of history for writers because writing for the theatre was a very good way for people of perhaps a lower social class to make money from writing. Playwriting was a form of writing at the time which enabled writers to earn a reasonable amount of money reasonably consistently if your writing was popular, which APHRA Behn's proved to be. In some ways we can think at the time of playwriting as a meritocratic form of writing because it was about being popular. And in this time in the Restoration, the theatre was really sort of a wonderful place for social mobility because you had everyone from all different classes in society. People could mix to a much greater extent, particularly if you were part of the theatre company, if you were part of the running of the theatre. And indeed, Charles II's most famous mistress, perhaps, is the actress Nell Gwyn. And it's perhaps through these theatre connections that APHRA Behn got to know the court of Charles II and perhaps indeed to spy for the court of Charles II. So I've said that writing for the theatre was a way for people from many different social classes to earn money. And indeed it's this earning of money that means that APHRA Behn has gone down as one of the most important women in terms of English literary history. As Vita Sackville-West declared, Vita Sackville-West was an intense friend of Virginia Woolf and indeed an inspiration for Virginia Woolf, for example, in the character of Orlando from the novel Orlando. And Vita Sackville-West declared in her book about APHRA Behn, The Incomparable Astrea from 1927, the importance of APHRA Behn is that she was the first woman in England to earn her living by her pen. In other words, APHRA Behn was the first professional woman writer, or at least, according to the records as we have them, she is the first woman writer. Of course, evidence may come up at a later date that means that she isn't, but for now, it's a bit like science really. Theories are correct until they're proved to be wrong. For now, she has gone down at least as the first professional woman writer. In that sense, she was really breaking the mould even in her own time, being a professional woman writer, making money by her pen, living by her pen. And as you can imagine, that was something that she had to negotiate even in her own time, as you can see from many of her prefaces to her published versions of her plays, one of which I'll look at a bit in a moment. But just to run through quickly then some of her publication, some of her text. So as I've said, she was primarily known as a playwright, which is how she really earned her money. So you may have heard of The Rover, for example, from 1677, and then the sequel, because The Rover was so popular, she wrote a sequel, the second part of The Rover from 1681. She's also known as a novelist, or we might say a proto-novelist, particularly, for example, you may have heard of Oronuku, which was published in 1688. And if we think of the Fair Clarinda, as I'm going to go on to discuss, as a text that is about playing with and challenging and exploring gender expectations and roles and identities, then you can look at Oronuku as a text that does similar kinds of things with race. She was also a published poet, for example, Poems on Several Occasions from 1684. So she wrote in many different forms and was in that sense a bit of a kind of chameleon. The important point is that APHRA BEHN's name was known to the public, known to the reading public. She didn't write anonymously. Her name appeared on the title pages of her works, and her gender as well, written by Mrs. A. Behn. They often say on the title page. As a playwright, APHRA BEHN examined and played with the theatricality, the performance of gender. So you can see that, for example, in The Rover, in the character of Helena. And I think this theatrical background is important when we look at the poem, because she was very familiar, Behn was very familiar with the difference, you might say, or at least the fluidity between actor and role, and between person and the performance of identity. If you live in the world of the theatre, then you live in a world in which people put on and take off identities all the time. To the Fair Clarinda seems to be asking, why not do that with gendered identities too? So before I get to looking at the poem in particular, I want to look at a preface to one of her plays, because she explores similar ideas and I think it will help elucidate the poem for us. So as I've said, throughout her work, Behn played with gender roles and expectations, and she does that explicitly in the preface to her play The Luckey Chance, which was published in 1686. All I ask, she writes in the preface, so this is in her own voice. Of course, even a writer writing in their own voice is still performing authorship and performing themselves, you can argue, but still, this is from the voice of Mrs. A. Behn. All I ask is the privilege for my masculine part, the poet in me, if any such you will allow me, to tread in those successful paths my predecessors have so long thrived in. If I must not, because of my sex, have this freedom, but that you will usurp all to yourselves, I lay down my quill, and you shall hear no more of me. No, not so much as to make comparisons, because I will be kinder to my brothers of the pen than they have been to a defenceless woman. I value fame as much as if I had been born a hero. There's a dichotomy that is evident here that I want to go on to discuss in the poem To the Fair Clarinda, and that dichotomy is that Behn simultaneously challenges gender conventions, but also adheres to them, particularly when it is convenient to her. And perhaps she adheres to them and shows that they are convenient to her in order to point out their limitations. So Behn writes, my masculine part in me. So she's really possessing the masculine part, my in me. That she, and she has her gender, as I've said, on the title page, written by Mrs. A. Behn, that she has inside her also a masculine part. So this is a Mrs. with a masculine part. But she also says that this masculine part is the writer in her. So there's, you could say, an acceptance of the conventional idea that writing is masculine. She also calls herself a defenceless woman in kind of full chivalric mode, drawing on ideas, as I've said, of chivalry, that these other male writers, my brothers of the pen, should not attack a mere defenceless woman, a kind of classic chivalric trope. Men, particularly brothers, are supposed to be there to protect women, not to attack them. And she's really drawing explicitly on established gender roles and expectations here, because she mentions gender particularly. She does not say, for example, fellows of the pen to a defenceless person. No, this is gendered. My brothers of the pen to a defenceless woman. She also uses, or you might say exploits, conventional gender dynamics in saying that she will be kinder than her writer brothers. Kindness is often seen as a feminine quality, rightly or wrongly. So she's sort of saying, I will be kind and I'm defenceless. When, of course, her brothers of the pen know full well that she isn't, that she's writing all these bawdy jokes, that she's writing these popular, outrageous, joke-filled, bawdy plays. So she's putting on this gendered role of being a kind, defenceless woman, knowing that her brothers of the pen must know that that isn't altogether the case. She's not defenceless, she's got her wit. And there's something very interesting, I think, going on in the final bit of this extract, which comes up again in the poem To the Fair Clarinda. I value fame as much as if I had been born a hero. And the important word here, I think, is if. She would have been the same person even if she happened to have been born a man. So even if she happened to have been born into a different body, that her inner self would remain the same regardless of her outer body, whether she happened to be a hero, man, or a woman. I think that's a really interesting idea that she's kind of playing on now. In some ways, quite a modern idea, that she would still have the same characteristics if she happened to have been born into a different body. So I'm now going to look at these same kind of dichotomies, these same challenges that Ben is pulling on here in the preface to the Luckey Chance in the poem To the Fair Clarinda. So I particularly want to think about the ways that Ben simultaneously adheres to and challenges gender conventions and expectations, and also how she sort of playfully uses them and exploits them for her own ends, to make, not quite to make a joke of it, but to show the limitations of these gendered expectations by using them to her own advantage. To say, okay, you think I'm a woman, well, in that case, I'm going to use the fact that I'm a woman to stop you doing what you want, which is attacking me. Because if you accept gender norms, then it will be wrong for you to attack a defenceless woman. So it's almost trying to hoist the other person on their own petard by saying, if you think that gender norms apply, then you shouldn't be attacking me. If you attack me as a defenceless woman, you are already sort of acknowledging that I have some weapons of my own, my wit, you might say, and therefore the masculine part, the writing, the wit, and that I can use that to attack you. The idea that if you accept the codes of chivalry, then you accept the idea that man should not attack defenceless woman. So if you're a man and you are attacking a woman, you are either going against chivalric codes, or you're showing that you don't think that woman is defenceless because she is able to attack you back. And how is she able to attack you back? Through the masculine part in her, which is the writing part in her. So now I turn to the poem itself, To the Fair Clarinda. So first I'm going to read it all the way through, and then I'm going to unpick it in more detail. To the fair Clarinda, who made love to me, imagined more than woman, by Mrs. B. Fair, lovely maid, or if that title be too weak, too feminine for nobler thee, permit a name that much more approaches truth, and let me call thee lovely, charming youth. This last will justify my soft complaint, while that may serve to lessen my constraint, and without blushes I the youth pursue, when so much beauteous woman is in view. Against thy charms we struggle, but in vain. With thy deluding form thou givest us pain, while the bright nymph betrays us to the swain. In pity to our sex, sure thou wert sent, that we might love and yet be innocent. For sure no crime with thee we can commit, or if we should, thy form excuses it. For who that gathers fairest flowers believes a snake lies hid beneath the fragrant leaves. Thou, beauteous wonder of a different kind, soft Chloris with dear Alexis joined, whate'er the manly part of thee would plead, thou tempts us with the image of the Maid, while we the noblest passions do extend, the love to Hermes, Aphrodite, the friend. So to start with the title then, even just the title, there is so much going on. To the fair Clarinda, who made love to me, imagined more than woman, by Mrs. B. So we know that it's a poem about two women. So Clarinda is more than woman, which means that she is at least in part woman, and Mrs. B. So there are two women. And this is a poem, a love poem explicitly, so made love to me. It's a poem about attraction. It's a poem about desire between two women. We can also see that it is a poem about sort of power dynamics or about pursuit. Who made love to me? So one of the questions that sort of follows on throughout the rest of the poem is who makes love to whom? Who pursues whom? And that's set up here in the title. The use of imagined, I think, is also worth noting. So it's about imagination, it's about fancy, it's about looking beyond the normal realms of reality, or you might say outside of the realms of conventional facts. I think the use of the word more is interesting as well. I'm not sure that we should necessarily take more here to mean better. So imagined more than woman. I'm not sure that that means better than woman, but more as in sort of outside or beyond. I also think it's worth noting that this is woman as symbol rather than a woman in particular. So to the fair Clarinda, individual, who made love to me, imagined more than woman. Imagined more than woman as symbol, rather than to the fair Clarinda, who made love to me, imagined more than a woman. So even just by not having that a in there, it's the idea of woman being kind of representative of something, as symbolic of something, as a kind of figurative label for something. I think we should also think about the name Clarinda too. So Clarinda with an O, Clorinda, is a character from Tasso's epic poem Jerusalem Delivered, published in 1581. And this is pointed out by Janet Todd in her biography, The Secret Life of APHRA BEHN, which is really, really worth a read if you're interested in APHRA BEHN. So Clorinda, is a warrior, an Amazonian figure in the Saracen army. She is introduced in the second canto of Tasso's epic poem when she rescues Sophronia and Olindo from execution. As an Amazonian warrior woman, Tasso's figure of Clorinda plays with notions of gender roles, masculinity, chivalry, etc. So APHRA BEHN's choice of the character's name, Clarinda, alludes to these same questionings of gender expectations and ideas of chivalry, which very, very basically and very essentially boil down to the idea that the man is active and the woman is passive, particularly in the trope of romance, that the man pursues and that the woman is pursued. I also just want to point out that this poem all the way through is in the second person, which means that it addresses a you, or in this case a thee, thy. Clarinda is referred to as you, which is gender neutral. So Clarinda is not called she or he anywhere in the poem. So we can think then that APHRA BEHN avoids using the gendered pronoun, so she avoids using she or her to refer to Clarinda, and so avoids sort of pinning Clarinda down to a biological sex, linguistically. So I'm now going to look at the poem itself in a bit more detail. So the first section, fair lovely maid, or if that title be too weak, too feminine for nobler thee, permit a name that more approaches truth, and let me call thee lovely charming youth. So we've got these kind of titles here. Fair lovely maid, lovely charming youth. Those stereotypical kinds of label. We also see that the fair is brought down from To the Fair Clarinda and given straight to fair lovely maid, almost immediately associating the fair Clarinda with the fair lovely maid. Immediately that is interrogated and questioned by the narrative voice, or if that title be. So it's the idea already of a label that is put on. It's a title, it's a designation. It's not an internal sense of identity, it's an external sense of identity, a title. If that title be too weak, too feminine for nobler thee. And again, so as I was talking about in the preface to the Luckey Chance, we've got this idea of sort of almost conforming to gender expectations in order to expose their limitations. So you link here too weak and too feminine. You link it through the double use of too weak, too feminine. And you kind of elide them, too weak and feminine. So on the one hand, you're apparently conforming to the gendered expectations of the feminine being weaker, but at the same time, you're distancing from the female figure by calling her a maid and then saying if that title, if that external designation doesn't fit, if it's too feminine and too weak for you. So you're already saying, but this character, this woman, Clarinda, is leaving those apparently womanly traits behind. And then at the end of this couplet, we've got the immediate rhyme. So this is a poem that's in rhyming couplets and in iambic pentameter, very standard form at the time. But the rhyme here, title be nobler thee. From the very beginning then, we're asked to think about and contrast titles and kind of nobler characteristics than titles. Maybe you might think kind of inherently what makes someone more noble than their title. Title be nobler thee, and how maybe the title and thee don't necessarily fit with each other. Permit a name, again, name, it's the idea of title, the idea of external designation or categorization. Permit a name that more approaches truth. And this is interesting, I think, because it's not to do with facts, for want of a better phrase, or saying this is the exact truth or the whole truth, or there is one truth, you are either maid or you are charming youth, but saying that it more approaches truth. So it's closer to a representation of truth. So it's sort of subtly unpicking that idea that there is necessarily one answer. It more approaches something that's representative, or a truthful representation, more approaches that. And let me call thee. And again, call. It's about external naming or giving of a title. So let me call thee lovely charming youth. So we have an explicit comparison between fair lovely maid and lovely charming youth. So fair maid and charming youth, which are the standard pastoral images of male and female characters, and it's linked through the word lovely. In the repetition of the word lovely, it's sort of echoing the idea of a double identity in using that same word twice, that lovely applies equally to both the male and the female elements of Clarinda's character or identity. And then the next section of the poem, this last, so youth, the label youth, this last will justify my soft complaint, while that maid may serve to lessen my constraint, and without blushes I the youth pursue, when so much beauteous woman is in view. So what I think is interesting here is the way that the speaker is saying that the change in Clarinda's gendered identity affects the way that the speaker responds to Clarinda. So this last, thinking of you as a youth, so that the charming youth of pastoral poetry, which applies to man. So thinking of you as a man, or with more manly qualities, or thinking of the elements of you that make me think of you as a charming youth, will justify my soft complaint. When the speaker thinks of Clarinda as a youth, that makes the speaker become softer. You might say become more feminine. A complaint was a common poetic form well into the 17th century, where the speaker sort of laments ill treatment, often ill treatment in love. So we might think of Thomas Wyatt's poem, They Flee From Me, for example, from 1557. So while is an interesting word because it suggests there's a sense of these two things simultaneously happening. So while me thinking of you as a youth justifies my soft complaints, justifies me becoming more feminine and softer, while that is happening, so the maid in you, may serve to lessen my constraint. May serve to lessen my constraint means that the speaker might become more active in the pursuit of the maid, of Clarinda kind of as maid. Thinking of Clarinda as a maid makes the speaker feel bolder and emboldened. It lessens my constraint. It means I feel more able to pursue you. The next couplet I think is quite a confusing one, and I have struggled for a long time to kind of understand what I really think it means. So, and without blushes I the youth pursue, when so much beauteous woman is in view. So what I take this to mean, although I'm very open to suggestions, so do leave them in the comments if you understand the poem here differently. And without blushes I the youth pursue seems to be then a uniting. So we've had in the previous two lines we've had this idea that when Clarinda seems more masculine, that makes the speaker feel more feminine, and when Clarinda seems more feminine, that makes the speaker feel more masculine. And then here, sort of following up that idea, is, it seems to me, perhaps a bringing out of both those two characters having more masculine qualities. So, and without blushes I the youth pursue. So the speaker then now seems to have become an active pursuer. So in kind of traditional pastoral imagery, where you have the male pursuer, that now seems to be what the character Mrs. B, the speaker, has adopted. So without blushes I pursue. So has dropped feminine blushes, and blushing is generally more associated with the feminine than with the masculine. So without blushes I am actively pursuing. But then the speaker is actively pursuing the youth, so the male figure. So now we have two masculine figures, it seems. When so much beauteous woman is in view. Does this then refer to both Mrs. B and Clarinda? So that there's so much beauteous woman because they are both in this moment feeling like beauteous women? If that were the case, then you've got these kind of four lines which mix up the gender identities completely. So you've got youth, soft, feminine, maid, lessen my constraint, masculine, without blushes I the youth pursue. So in this then they're both masculine, when so much beauteous woman is in view. So they both become feminine, they both become women again. So in that sense you'd have a complete sort of mixture, male, female, female, male, 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 female, female. Or alternatively, you might read it as the youth, not applying to Clarinda, but applying to the speaker. So, and without blushes, I the youth. So I am the youth now, and because I, the speaker, Mrs. B, is now the youth, she, he, they feel kind of emboldened to pursue Clarinda, because when so much beauteous woman is in view, so Clarinda has now become a beauteous woman in the eyes, in the view of the speaker, and Mrs. B has now become I, the youth, I, the masculine figure, I, the man. I think that's up for debate, so do debate it if you want to. So moving on to the next section, and you can see immediately that the form is different. So immediately something is standing out. We've got a triplet, so it's no longer heroic couplets, it's now a heroic triplet, and we've got these three rhymes: vain, pain, swain. And the first couplet we might think of as a kind of traditional pastoral couplet, and it's apparently representing a kind of standard pastoral trope, which is the struggle and the pain of love. Against thy charms we struggle but in vain, with thy deluding form thou givest us pain. And it's not clear what whose the charms are in terms of what exactly they refer to. So on the one hand, charm, the word seems to link back to the idea of charming youth. So charm then would be a kind of or at least associated with the youth, with the masculine here in this poem. But then at the same time, we've just had this idea that so much beauteous woman is in view. So now are your charms associated with you, Clarinda, as a beauteous woman? What's also interesting in this section, I think, is that we've moved from I, the speaker being an I, to the plural, to we. So we and us. We struggle, give us pain. Who is this group now who've entered? Who is being represented here by this we, when before it was I and my? A swain is a typical pastoral figure in pastoral poetry. A male shepherd, lover, who actively pursues amorous encounters. What seems to be being said here in this line, while the bright nymph betrays us to the swain, and betrays is quite a strong and interesting word here, I think. The bright nymph, it might mean that the brightness sort of attracts the speaker, the speaker and the other women, we think, us pain, who are looking at Clarinda, perhaps in friendship, and we'll see friendship comes in towards the end of the poem. So perhaps we're attracted to the bright nymph in friendship, and then we're betrayed to the swain. So then comes in this idea of sexual pursuit or desirous pursuit, or the pursuit of amour. Another use of the word betray, I think, which is worth drawing out a little bit more, is a kind of ironic use of it, which will become clear in the next section of the poem. Often sexual encounters are revealed or are evidenced by or are betrayed by pregnancy. But of course, pregnancy is not, you're not going to be betrayed by pregnancy if you have a relationship or a courtship or an amour between two women. So going back to this idea of form quickly. So the couplet, as I said, is a standard pastoral trope in that it's the idea of struggling against your lover's charms, and that struggle is painful, physically painful, burning with love. We have that sort of imagery and that sort of phrase. So you've got that sort of standard couplet, but then you've got the introduction of this additional line at the end which challenges that conventional standard image that has been presented to us. So in the next section of the poem we seem to move out to a broader consideration of sort of society and cultural expectations and emphasis. In pity to our sex sure thou wert sent, that we might love and yet be innocent. For sure no crime with thee we can commit, or if we should, fill in the blank, thy form excuses it. For who that gathers fairest flowers believes a snake lies hid beneath the fragrant leaves. So earlier when I was talking about the preface to Luckey Chance, I was talking about the idea of Ben employing stereotypes in order to show their limitations, or to say, okay, fine, if you want to believe in stereotypes, you believe in them, but I'm going to use them for my own advantage, so I'm going to hoist you on your own petard. And a similar thing, I think, is happening here too. So, in pity to our sex, sure thou wert sent. So in compassion to our sex, sure thou wert sent, that we might love and yet be innocent. And innocent in terms of reputation. And as I was saying earlier, perhaps bringing in this idea of betrayal, and pregnancy obviously was a real worry for women in conventional heterosexual relationships, and that, if you were found to be pregnant and you were found to be guilty of the crime or the sin of having sex outside of marriage. But that's not a problem here. The speaker seems to be saying that in compassion to our sex, so here I think that means women, thou wert sent. Almost as though you were sent, from God above. You were sent to us, a mixture of male and female, of maid and youth, that we might love, we might have desires, amours, sexual encounters, and yet be innocent, not be found guilty of having committed any crime, which is, again, an interesting word for Ben to bring into the poem. For sure, no crime with thee we can commit. If there's no evidence that a crime has taken place, then you can't be found guilty of it. And the evidence, you might say, is pregnancy. And this final couplet, I think, really plays on this idea of expectations. It's almost a kind of rhetorical question, or a rhetorical joke about society and who thinks this. For who that gathers fairest flowers believes a snake lies hid beneath the fragrant leaves. And you can see that it's a kind of rhetorical joke, because the who, it's not clear who the who refers to, because the poem up until this point has been explaining this very thing, or describing this very thing, that amongst the fairest flowers, and again, fair going back to the idea of fair, lovely maid, fairest flowers, all together sort of symbolising the feminine. So that gathers fairest flowers, that a snake lies hid beneath the fragrant leaves. And yes, snake is a phallic joke. It's a phallic joke in the 17th century just as much as it is now. And Ben makes the same joke in other texts, for example, in The Disappointment. This exact point has been made by Mrs. B by the speaker throughout the rest of the poem. So who is this who? Because the speaker has been explaining it to the reader that this is exactly the case, that amongst these fairest flowers, amongst this womanly form, lies hidden this masculine energy, this snake. The symbolism, the kind of phallic symbolism that goes along with snake. So the idea of active pursuit, the idea of sort of active, desiring sexuality. If we're thinking of the symbolism of the snake being also the symbolism of the swain figure. And of course, you've got the sort of, in the background, you've got the symbolism of the Garden of Eden, and you've got the idea of being tempted to things that you shouldn't know anything about, in the figure of Eve, the Garden of Eden, and the figure of the snake. And then, almost as if we're leaving that joke kind of hanging for the reader to ponder, we have a break, and then we have the next stanza. So, thou beauteous wonder of a different kind, soft Chloris with dear Alexis joined, whenever the manly part of thee would plead, thou tempts us with the image of the maid, while we the noblest passions do extend, the love to Hermes, Aphrodite the friend. So at the beginning of this stanza then we've got the beauteous wonder, thou beauteous wonder. So that's repeating the word beauteous again. So before we had so much beauteous woman in view, and now we've got a beauteous wonder of a different kind. So perhaps something imagined more than woman. This beauteous wonder, which is different from the beauteous woman from before. We've got a repetition then again of the word soft, so soft associated with Chloris, and that's going back perhaps to the idea of the soft complaint from earlier when Mrs. B was talking about her own soft complaint in response to thinking of Clarinda as a youth. And here in soft Chloris, the word soft is again associated with a pastoral figure, a female pastoral figure, a kind of template of a female pastoral figure. The poem is typical of much Restoration lyric poetry in that it draws on pastoral imagery and the themes of sexual love common to pastoral poetry, as the names Chloris and Alexis suggest, these are sort of stock names in pastoral poetry. So in the line soft Chloris with the dear Alexis joined, there's a uniting there of genders. Joined, joining these two stock pastoral figures, and so uniting all the qualities that those stock figures are supposed to be representative of. So in this figure of soft Chloris and dear Alexis joined, so a uniting of the genders, whenever the manly part of thee would plead. So when Clarinda, the manly part of Clarinda is pleading, so is pursuing, thou tempts us with the image of the maid. So that's the reverse of that traditional pastoral image, which is that the female figure is the tempting figure and the male figure pursues the tempting female figure. While we, the noblest passions, do extend the love to Hermes, Aphrodite the friend. So you've got a beautiful use of chiasmus here by APHRA BEHN, and chiasmus is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as a grammatical figure by which the order of words in one of two parallel clauses is inverted in the other. So essentially you've got the kind of structure A, B, B, A, or you might say like a kind of book, so A, B, B, A, and you've got the comma in the middle. And this creates a kind of sense of balance, or you might say a sense of reciprocity between love, Hermes, Aphrodite, friend. And you might say that the form then encourages that to be seen as sort of cyclical. So also in the structure here you have Hermes and Aphrodite almost exactly united, split by a comma. So you virtually have Hermaphrodite. So Hermes and Aphrodite, they're two gods, two Greek gods, handsome Hermes and beautiful Aphrodite. They had a son called Hermaphroditus, and the name Hermaphroditus is a uniting of their two names, of Hermes and Aphrodite. And as a symbol, Hermaphroditus symbolises a figure who is a mixture of the sexes, or a joining of the sexes, or uniting of the sexes, or however it is that you want to see it. I said earlier that BEHN repeatedly, I think, plays on this idea of hoisting the people who have kind of traditional or conventional gender expectations, hoisting them on their own petard. And I think that you can see that here in this final couplet. So the speaker is saying, while we, the noblest passions do extend. So we have passion for Clarinda, but we're extending those passions in a way that is conforming to usual gender expectations. So we're extending our passionate love to Hermes, the male figure, and our passionate friendship we're extending to Aphrodite, the female figure. And that idea, I think, also goes back to the previous section that I was talking about, which is the joke of the hidden snake, etc., which is that if you accept the idea that a snake cannot hide beneath the fragrant leaves of the fairest flower, so that this masculine phallic energy can't hide beneath the fair, lovely maid figure. If you believe that, then you cannot see anything other than innocent interaction between two women. Because if you think that a feminine or traditionally female feminine figure is passive, as is the case in the traditional image of the active sexual masculinity and passive femininity, if you believe that, if you think that that's true, that a kind of active sexual desire cannot hide beneath the fragrant flowers, then when there are two women together, you cannot think that anything sexual would be happening there. Going back to the final couplet then, while we the noblest passions do extend the love to Hermes and Aphrodite the friend, it's kind of almost closing on this idea of, well, we're going back to an accepted norm again. We're saying that we extend love to Hermes, so love to the man and friendship to the woman. But even in the image, it seems that that idea is being played with, because of course Aphrodite is the figure, is the symbol of love. She is the Greek goddess of love. So is it deliberately disingenuous then for the speaker here in the final line to bring in the idea that these passions that are being extended are friendship to the figure, the symbol of love. Before I close, I want to bring in some context for the word hermaphrodite. So in her own time, APHRA BEHN, because of her writing and her playing with gender roles in that writing, was called a hermaphrodite. This is from a journal from Parnassus, which was written in about 1688. So we note that that is the same year as To the Fair Clarinda was published. So Mount Parnassus in Greek mythology is the home of the Muses. So Parnassus or you use Parnassus, or it's often used as a synonym for poetry. This is what the author from a journal from Parnassus says explicitly about APHRA BEHN. Her works had neither wit enough for man nor modesty enough for a woman. She was to be looked upon as an hermaphrodite, and consequently not fit to enjoy the benefits and privileges of either sex, much less of this society. It seems to me that To the Fair Clarinda embraces such criticism and plays up to not conforming to gender norms and expectations, exactly as this author, the writer of a journal from Parnassus, does, in assuming, for example, that wit is for man and modesty is for woman. The author of a journal from Parnassus says dismissively that APHRA BEHN should be looked upon as an hermaphrodite and consequently not fit to enjoy the benefits and privileges of either sex. In APHRA BEHN's poem To the Fair Clarinda, however, it seems to me that we can interpret BEHN declaring that she can be looked upon as a hermaphrodite and consequently will determinedly enjoy the benefits and privileges of both sexes. So the author of a journal from Parnassus seems to think that this playing with genders or joining of genders in this hermaphroditic way means that the person is lesser. And it seems to me that APHRA BEHN is saying absolutely the opposite, that this uniting of sexes, that this drawing on both sexes makes for more. And we go back to the title, who made love to me imagined more than woman, that this isn't limiting, that it doesn't deny you the privileges and benefits of either sex, but enables you to enjoy both benefits and privileges of both sexes. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Remember, if you like what I do here on my channel where I analyse classic literature, then do subscribe. And if you've enjoyed the video, then do press the like button. It does help me out, as I've said before, in YouTube's algorithm. And I'd love to know what you make and what your response is to the poem To the Fair Clarinda by APHRA BEHN. Did it surprise you in any way? Was there anything that you particularly responded to in the poem? I'd love to know your thoughts.